I hated being punished as a kid, okay? Granted, I was also the oldest of of my brothers. So I was the firstborn, which means I was just hyper attuned to be the goody two shoes, as most firstborn kids are. And it wasn't so much because I wanted to do the right thing. It was more so because I was terrified of being punished for doing the wrong thing. That was my motivation, for all of my initial development in morals and ethics and worldview. I didn't want to get in trouble. So I avoided doing the wrong thing so that I would not get punished at all costs. However, I did what every young kid did growing up, as I'm sure every single one of you did, is you kind of tried to toe the line a little bit, right? You toed the line of what you could get away with and what your parents said that, would result in a spanking or discipline or timeouts or whatever, you name it. I toed the line to see, did my mom really mean it when she said that she'd spank me if I didn't clean my room? Did she really mean it that I get grounded if I, did this, that, or the other? How serious was she, right? I toed the line, and I know every single one of you were guilty of doing it too, right? It's our way of trying to exercise our sense of independence and our own desires and wants as kids, right? Even at the age of 4 years old, we're trying to figure that out. We toe the line because it turns out our innate desires aren't always what's actually good for us. And then there's one day when we actually cross that line, and then we are completely upset at our parents for following through on a punishment that they completely warned us about, right? We're like, come on, Mom, what gives, man? I'm trying to just live my life here. Who do you think you are to tell me, to get spanked because I took too many cookies from the cookie jar? I don't know, whatever. We get angry at them because they're doing the actual work of warning us, hey, if you cross this line, you're going to get punished as a means of actively forming us into good people. That we turn them into the bad guys because they're doing the hard thing to discipline us for the wrongs that we did, despite their efforts in making us better people, civilized adults, right? It's a tension there. And I think so many of us fall into similar tensions with God, where we look at all of the injustice and all of the evil in the world and we get angry at God for not doing a single thing about it. He's not being a God of justice after all. Why would he allow this to happen? Until it comes to our own lives, where then if God disciplines us for any evil or wrong things that we do, then we get angry at him for not being enough of a God of grace. So what do we want? See, we want a God to punish evil people until it comes to punishing us. Because surely we're not the bad guys, right? That's what we're talking about this morning. We're in week 4 of a 6-week series called Faith in Exile. As Jess had already alluded to, transitions often feel like exiles. Whether you're a new freshman here or transferring here or you're a family navigating a whole new transition of life, it tends to be that we're thrust into entire new seasons of our relationship with God as well, where we're navigating unknown territory, we're questioning God's goodness in the midst of it all, and we're wondering where are we at in the midst of it. So if you missed any sermons, or if this is your first time, if you scan the QR code, there should be links there to get you to our podcasts or our YouTube channel, so you can catch up on any of these sermons at any point. If you're looking for some better content for your runs or your workouts or your commutes, you can use that. So feel free to subscribe. But just to recap, in week 1, we talked about how important it is to have spiritual friends and community in the midst of your exile, right? We're able to withstand these seasons of exile when we have good spiritual friends. In week 2, we talked about how to be good workers in exile, because perhaps one of the places where we feel the most exiled is when we clock in for work every single day. So we talked about how to be faithful, good workers, even in the midst of exile. Then last week, Pastor Isaiah gave a phenomenal sermon on what it means to be planted where God has you, to not wish away your season of exile, but perhaps God has something here for you in the midst of this. It's so good. I highly recommend going back and listening to that one. But today, we're talking about a really, really hard topic that has to be addressed. What do we do when it's our sin that sends us into exile? What do we do when our sin is what sends us into exile? So if you have a Bible, open up to Genesis chapter 4. I'm reading from the New Living Translation, okay? If you don't have a Bible, raise your hand. Our ushers are going to come around. We have a couple of copies of Bibles here that we'll be able to pass out if you want to read along. If you don't own a Bible, please keep this. This is our gift to you. So make sure then you can mark it up, you can highlight it. It's our gift to you. So feel free. You don't have to return it back. And if we need to go back and grab some more, we can. Keep those hands raised way up high. It's on page 4 of our Bibles. So as you're turning there, this story takes place after Adam and Eve, the first humans that God creates, and they are shortly after banished from the Garden of Eden for eating of the forbidden fruit, committing the first sin. In fact, you could say they were exiled, right? The theme of exile shows up all over the place in Scripture. And while the first human beings give birth to the first children, Cain and Abel, and boy, do they have quite the story. Here's how their story goes. Genesis chapter 4, beginning in verse 1. Now Adam had sexual relations with his wife, Eve, and she became pregnant. When she gave birth to Cain, she said, "With the Lord's help, I have produced a man." Later, she gave birth to his brother and named him Abel. When they grew up, Abel became a shepherd, while Cain cultivated the ground. When it was time for the harvest, Cain presented some of his crops as a gift to the Lord. Abel also brought a gift, the best portions of the firstborn lambs from his flock. The Lord accepted Abel and his gift, but he did not accept Cain and his gift. This made Cain very angry, and he looked dejected. So the first thing we can notice here is that we already have a bit of a sibling rivalry taking place here, all right? Anybody have rivalries with their siblings growing up? Oh yeah, let me tell you a story. My brother, Andrew, is 2 years younger than I was, and we participated in this glorious thing called 4-H. Anybody 4-Hers here? All right, yeah, we see you, 4-Hers. So we just did some classic arts and crafts projects. I made this birdhouse thing. It looked pretty cool. My brother made some dinosaur land out of like paint and egg cartons and little dinosaur figurines. It was cute, you know. And we both put in equal amounts of work, y'all. And yet, Andrew was the one who got this really beautiful, pretty purple ribbon that congratulated him on his excellent work. And I was like, what the heck, man? You know, my birdhouse was just as great. Who's this guy? Who does he think he is? Are these judges giving him this reward when I put in just as much effort, you know? Right there. It's like we get into fights with our siblings over so many things. And we see this happening right here with Cain and Abel. And I imagine that's a bit of what's happening here. Cain was a farmer. He presents some of his crops to the Lord as an offering. And then Abel was a shepherd, and it says that he presents some of the best portions of the firstborn lambs to the Lord as an offering as well. Now, many sermons over this passage suggest that like Cain's offering wasn't accepted because it wasn't the best portions of his crops or something like that. Well, the text really doesn't allude to anything like that of being the issue of what was given. Rather, God's rejection of Cain's gift wasn't due to what he gave, but how he gave it. Okay, let's continue on in verses 6 and 7. Why are you so angry? The Lord asked Cain. Why do you look so dejected? You will be accepted if you do what is right. But if you refuse to do what is right, then watch out. Sin is crouching at the door, eager to control you. But you must subdue it and be its master. So what this passage is suggesting is that somehow Cain did something wrong when he gave his gift. And perhaps this is because it was about his heart posture not being correct. Because as much as God values the offerings we give and all the actions we do, if our heart posture isn't right behind it, then that's where we are up for criticism and maybe a little bit of condemnation. 1 Samuel 15:22 tells us this, that what is more pleasing to the Lord? Your burnt offerings and sacrifices, or your obedience to his voice? Listen, obedience is better than sacrifice, and submission is better than offering the fat of rams. The actions we do for God don't matter if our hearts aren't right. Amelia is our oldest. She's 4.5 years old, and she's a wonderful, wonderful human being. And sometimes when I ask her to do chores, like, cleaning up her toys, for example, she is all about it. She turns it into a game. She's like, okay, Daddy. She picks it up, and it's fine. It's great. It's marvelous. Great job, Amelia. Then there's other times where I ask her to do the very same thing, and then she just simply responds with, she just bemoans, she sighs, she pouts, and all of a sudden her legs are tired and she wants to go to bed. And I'm like, that's a hunk of baloney, right? That's a hunk of baloney. And so I had to ask more sternly for her to do it and to warn her that if she doesn't obey, then we have to discipline her. And then she finally drags herself into it, and she's like, just throws her toys around, and just pouting the whole time. And she is technically doing what I asked her to do, but how she's going about it, just because she did what I said, doesn't mean I was pleased with how she went about it. And I think sometimes we get more concerned with doing what God asks of us, but forget to consider how to do what God asks of us. The attitude, the posture, the heart behind it, right? Like where we want the benefit of God's blessing without the commitment to his ways. And then we get mad because God isn't honoring our actions when he wants our hearts, but our hearts aren't behind it. So how can we get angry at him for this? And that's perhaps what's going on with Cain here. He's going through the motions. He's paying lip service to God with his offering. And then Cain is angry because he wants the reward of full devotion to God while towing the line of how much is truly expected of him. How much can he obey without fully obeying? Maybe we've been guilty of doing the same thing. But God calls him out on it, and he warns Cain that sin is crouching at the door, eager to control you, but you must subdue it and be its master. That's what verse 7 says. And what's really interesting is there's some other translations of the Hebrew here who actually pose that command as a question. Instead of some authoritative parent saying, you must subdue sin and be its master, God simply asks it as a question. Will you subdue it? Will you be its master? The choice is on you, Cain. What are you going to do with this? It's up to you. But don't cross the line. And just like a rebellious toddler who wants to see if his parents were serious by that threat, Cain toes the line. Maybe even crosses it. Because he does not take this warning seriously. Let's continue on in verses 8 through 14. One day, Cain suggested to his brother, let's go out into the fields. And while they were there in the field, Cain attacked his brother, Abel, and killed him. Afterward, the Lord asked Cain, where is your brother? Where is Abel? I don't know, Cain responded. Am I my brother's keeper? Am I my brother's guardian? But the Lord said, what have you done? Listen, your brother's blood cries out to me from the ground. Now you are cursed and banished from the ground, which has swallowed your brother's blood. No longer will the ground yield good crops for you, no matter how hard you work. From now on, you will be a homeless wanderer on the earth. I would say God meant it by his threat. He curses Cain and banishes him. He sends him off into exile, where he will be a homeless wanderer on this earth, separated from his family, from his homeland, and from his God. And Cain, again, like a rebellious child, sounds surprised when he receives his punishment. He replies to God like this in verses 13 through 14. My punishment is too great for me to bear. You have banished me from the land and from your presence. You have made me a homeless wanderer. Anyone who finds me will kill me. I mean, Cain was completely content to commit this sin and murder his brother. And now he's all upset at God for actually following through on his promise to condemn this sin. So here lies the tension. Do we want a God of justice or do we want a God of grace? Do we want a God of justice or do we want a God of grace? And I think all of us say we want a God who is both, which he is, okay? He is both a just God and a gracious God, but that is paradoxical for us to wrap our minds around this truth. He is both a just God and a gracious God, but in any situation where God extends grace, it seems like he's not being just enough. Or whenever he is just, it seems like he's not extending enough grace. They almost seem to contradict each other. And this is the oxymoron of complaints against God. That he doesn't do enough to punish injustice, and when he does, he doesn't seem to extend enough grace. Like we can't be pleased with whatever he does. Well, one of the ways that God works his grace and his justice is through human agents in this world. We have to acknowledge that's one of the ways he does. He empowers us to serve out his purposes. And sometimes you see this play out in a lot of different scenarios. Okay? For example, we want justice against countries who still enact slave labor to this day, right? But then we get up in arms when announcements about tariffs are going against these countries, specifically as an effort to penalize them for their slave labor, because it just doesn't seem nice enough to these countries. We want justice for criminals who commit murderous, heinous acts, but then we think our law enforcement systems aren't nice enough, right? We want God to end the sex slave industry across the globe, but then we want grace extended to us every time we still fall into our pornography addiction. Or we read that sexualized literature that very much still fuels demand for sex, for the sex slave industry. We want justice for that, but grace for me to keep falling into this sin, right? We want God to end poverty and provide for the poor, but we're unwilling to give to the poor ourselves. We want God to end abortion, but we're unwilling to support foster care or adoption agencies ourselves. You see the tension here? Not to mention when we get super personal, when we commit sin, we want the grace for it, but we also shouldn't be surprised if we actually feel a little bit exiled because of it. Maybe that is a literal exile and that you lose a job for improper behavior, or more metaphorical, that you're exiled from a relationship because of sexual immorality, or decisions from your past catch up to you and displace you from your current season of comfort and coziness. There is disciplinary action for our sin, and we got to get that. And as much as we want God to just respond with His grace, we cannot be surprised if we receive a punishment that is more than we can bear, and if it catches up to us. You see, and what's really fascinating about Cain's story is that it's actually a prelude of sorts to what God's people would later face. Okay? The book of Genesis simply means origins. It's all about the origin story of God's people known as the Israelites. Okay? And the rest of the Old Testament follows this people's lives and their stories, and man, they mess up time and time and time and time again. They cannot follow God's covenant for the life of them. And I want to hone in on one book in particular. It's called the book of Deuteronomy. It's the fourth book of the Bible, if you want to go ahead and turn there. In fact, I've actually heard that California surfers' favorite book of the Bible is Deuteronomy. Is that great? Zeke's from California. He liked that. That was just for you, Zeke. Deuteronomy. Turn to Deuteronomy chapter 28. That's page 102 if you're reading from our Bibles. It literally means second numbers, because it is a retelling of from Moses to God's people, recounting all of the instructions and laws and commands that God gave them as they wandered the desert for 40 years after being freed from Egypt and exile. Okay? And so Deuteronomy is covering a lot of those other things, all of those commands. So you see it all presented to them again. But you get to Deuteronomy 28, and it's beefy. It's 68 verses long. We're not going to read all 68. Okay? Is beefy. But I love the first 14 verses. It's all about God's prediction of Israel's blessings that they will receive from him if they choose to follow his covenant and refuse to turn from his ways. Okay? Let's just read the first 6 verses of chapter 28. Here's what it says. If you fully obey the Lord your God and carefully keep all his commands that I am giving you today, the Lord your God will set you high above all the nations of the world. You will experience all these blessings if you obey the Lord your God. Your towns and your fields will be blessed. Your children and your crops will be blessed. The offspring of your herds and flocks will be blessed. Your fruit baskets and breadboards will be blessed. Wherever you go and whatever you do, you will be blessed. Man, there's a Hobby Lobby sign out there somewhere with those verses on them. Right? Those are feel-good, man, pump in the arm kind of verses. And it echoes what God tells Cain at first. You will be accepted if you do what is right. You will be blessed if you followed my ways. But these 14 verses are just the first 20% of Deuteronomy 28. So what do you think the last 80% of Deuteronomy 28 is all about? The next 54 verses are all about God's promised curses and punishments on his people if they fail to abide in him. Let's just read a couple of sections, okay? We're going to look at 3 sections in Deuteronomy 28. And let's start with verses 15 through 19. But if you refuse to listen to the Lord your God and do not obey all the commands and decrees I am giving you today, all these curses will come and overwhelm you. Your towns and your fields will be cursed. Your fruit baskets and breadboards will be cursed. Your children and your crops will be cursed. The offspring of your herds and flocks will be cursed. Wherever you go and whatever you do, you will be cursed. Notice how that is the inverse of verses 1 through 6. All the things that you would be blessed by, you would be cursed by. Skip down to verses 49 through 52. When it says this, the Lord will bring a distant nation against you from the end of the earth, and it will swoop down on you like a vulture. It is a nation whose language you do not understand, a fierce and heartless nation that shows no respect for the old and no pity for the young. Its armies will devour your livestock and crops, and you will be destroyed. They will leave you no grain, new wine, olive oil, calves, or lambs, and you will starve to death. They will attack your cities until all the fortified walls in your land, the walls you trusted to protect you, are knocked down. They will attack all the towns in the land the Lord your God has given you. What's crazy is those verses are predicting what exactly happens almost 1,500 years later. In the year 722 BC, the Assyrian Empire, a heartless nation, comes in and conquers and exiles the northern kingdom of Israel. And then in 586 BC, the heartless nation of Babylon comes in and exiles the people of Judah from Jerusalem. Right? In fact, everything about the message that Isaiah preached last week occurs after that exile happens. This foreign nation of a language you don't understand comes in, destroys everything you have, brings you into an exiled land. But let's read one more section here in verses 63 through 65. Just as the Lord has found great pleasure in causing you to prosper and multiply, the Lord will find pleasure in destroying you. You will be torn from the land you are about to enter and occupy, for the Lord will scatter you among all the nations from one end of the earth to the other. There you will worship foreign gods that neither you nor your ancestors have known, gods made of wood and stone. There among those nations you will find no peace or place to rest. And the Lord will cause your heart to tremble, your eyesight to fail, and your soul to despair. What? Like, did we just read a passage that says that the God we worship, who loves us and is for us, right, who has plans to prosper us and give us a hope in the future, is also the very God who will cause our hearts to tremble, our eyesight to fail, and our soul to despair? Or what about this? What about the passage that says he will find pleasure in destroying his people, like some psychotic maniac who smiles and laughs as he murders an innocent person? Is that the God we actually worship? No. Okay, far from it. What we have to understand when we dig in here, when you understand how God's justice works, it's not that he finds this odd sense of happiness and pleasure like a dopamine rush when he murders off his people. It's that he is a God of justice, and therefore, he is pleased when justice is served. When what is wrong has been made right. And when wickedness is punished. He is a God of justice after all, right? But here's the thing about God's justice. We always think about him wanting to punish the sin and the injustices of all the pagan people out there who don't know God. But what's so fascinating is the majority of God's warnings and threats about the justice he will bring to evil is not towards people who don't know him and people groups who don't know him. There are certainly some passages in Scripture that are about that. But the majority of those passages, 95%, I would say, of the Scriptures of God's anger and justice and condemnation are towards none other than his own people who claim to follow him but do not. That includes you and me. Because he tells them again and again and again what his expectations are for a holy, righteous life if we choose to be in a relationship with him. And there is a punishment that comes if we don't abide by those words. If you don't claim, or if you claim to be in a covenant relationship with God, then your life is no longer your own, but his. And the life he gives us is so much better than the life that we can choose to have on our own. And yet we choose to toe the line, don't we? How much can we obey without fully obeying? How much can I give God of this, but I'm going to keep this as a part of my life? We toe the line. And yet we're surprised and maybe even angry if we're not blessed by God because of our insistence of continuing on in sin. We are more concerned with the sins of the world without having a care in the world for the sins in our life. Fix the problems with the world, God, but conveniently forget about my rebellious nature as you go about doing so. You got to think, why would God be more concerned about a sinful person who doesn't know God than a sinful person who does know God? What's worse in his eyes, a godless person doing godless things, or a person who says they know God and continues to do godless things? Are we living up to what we're professing? And these are hard passages to hear. But we got to talk about them because we can't pick and choose the passages of Scripture that make us feel better all the time. But this is the reality of what our sin does. Because we only want a gracious God when it conveniences us and a just God when it conveniences the world. But he is both a just and gracious God. And that means we have to own up to our sin and wayward living despite our claims perhaps of being devoted followers of him. We all have those areas in our life. However, here's what's interesting. When we envision God's justice, I think we often envision him somehow just divinely intervening to stop that murderer, or to put that criminal in prison, or to just put financial havoc on all of those, credit card companies who are just stealing debt from poor people who can't pay off the interest on their debts, right? Or you name the situation, we think of God just coming in, swooping in, and just making everything better immediately, especially if he can intervene before a wrong thing happens. But the majority of the time, get this, God's justice towards sin is simply letting sin play out because sin in itself is destructive. What a concept. God's justice towards sin is oddly simply letting it play out because sin in itself is destructive. The Apostle Paul really gets at this idea in Romans chapter 1 when he says this in verse 18, "But God shows his anger from heaven against all sinful, wicked people who suppress the truth by their wickedness." And how does he do so? Well, jump down to verse 24. "So God abandoned them to do whatever shameful things from their hearts desired." Jump down to verses 28 and 29. "Since they thought it foolish to acknowledge God, he abandoned them to do their foolish thinking and let them do things that should never be done. Their lives became full of every kind of wickedness, sin, greed, hate, envy, murder, quarreling, deception, malicious behavior, and gossip." What an odd concept. That God's justice on wicked, evil people is to abandon them to their wickedness and evil. Because their sin is their punishment. Their sin and the results of their sin is their exile. Oddly enough, God's justice on your porn addiction is letting you continue on in your porn addiction until it destroys you, until you can finally have a breaking point to turn back to him. God's justice on your misconduct at work is letting it get worse and worse until finally you lose your job because of it. God's justice on your anger issues is oddly letting your anger issues get worse and worse until it severs a relationship, ends in a divorce, and it forces you to finally get ready to reconnect with God to make this right. Because continuing on in our sin is a punishment in itself. And all he has to do is just stand back and watch it play out before his eyes. Until we get so down in it, when we are so overconsumed with it, when we thought that towing the line is going to be fine enough to where we are overwhelmed with the brokenness we have entered into, and we have no other choice but to beg God for mercy. And praise God, he is merciful. Because God is always standing right there at the edge of the pool, ready to extend a hand to us to help us as soon as we confess that we're drowning and we can't do this anymore. He is a God of justice and a God of grace. And he bestows grace and blessings upon even the worst of us because God's retribution is always connected to God's redemption. They are never separated. His retribution is always connected to God's redemption. And Cain replies to God, saying this punishment is too great for him to bear. He's destined to be a homeless wanderer, exiled from those he loves. He's bound to be killed by someone. And here's how God responds to Cain. The Lord replied, "No, for I will give a sevenfold punishment to anyone who kills you." Then the Lord put a mark on Cain to warn anyone who might try to kill him. So Cain left the Lord's presence and settled in the land of Nod, east of Eden. So despite Cain's exile, he was still protected by God. In fact, despite his destiny as a homeless wanderer, guess what? He winds up founding a city called Nod, east of Eden. Or he settles in the land called Nod, I should say. And then he eventually builds his own town named Enoch, which is named after one of his own sons. So he winds up still having a family and finding a city that he can call home despite this punishment of being exiled. God's grace was still with him even in the midst of this. And even in the book of Deuteronomy, after that harrowing passage of chapter 28, filled with all these predictions of God's retribution, God comes around and shares his plan of redemption in Deuteronomy chapter 30. In the future, when you experience all these blessings and curses I have listed for you, and when you are living among the nations to which the Lord your God has exiled you, take to heart all these instructions. If at that time you and your children return to the Lord your God, and if you obey with all your heart and all your soul all the commands I have given you today, then the Lord your God will restore your fortunes. He will have mercy on you and gather you back from all the nations where he has scattered you. Even though you are banished to the ends of the earth, the Lord your God will gather you from there and bring you back again. The Lord your God will return you to the land that belonged to your ancestors, and you will possess the land again. Then he will make you even more prosperous and numerous than your ancestors. In verse 6, the Lord your God will change your hearts and the hearts of all your descendants, so that you will love him with all your heart and soul, and that you may live. God's retribution is always connected to his redemption. He is a God of justice and a God of grace. They seem to be contradictory, but often God's justice must be seen through the lens of God's grace, and his grace must be seen through the lens of God's justice. They go hand in hand. They are inseparable. They are two sides of one coin. His punishments always lead to redemption. It just comes down to, are we willing to listen and respond in repentance? Are we willing to say, I'm drowning, I'm done with living this life on my own. Save me, God. Save me, God. So I'm going to invite our worship team back up here for us just to conclude in response. And yeah, I know, this is a hard sermon. This is a hard word. But we got to talk about this. And I also know that perhaps this is a message that is for several of us in here. You're trying so bad to live this double life. How's it working for you? And all God's going to do is he's just going to sit back and say, I'm waiting. I'm right here. I'm waiting. And perhaps today is your time. Whatever that thing is that's just been driving you in the ground and eating you from the inside out, where you're done paying lip service to God, whatever that looks like, today's your day to just repent of it, to get it off your chest, to go all in with the God who loves you, who isn't afraid to give us the discipline we need. He's a parent who doesn't bow down to his kids. There's plenty of those today. He's a God who loves us and does what is honestly hard for us because it makes us better versions of the people he has designed us to be. And so during this time of response and worship, I just want you to just know, like, the altar is open. A traditional sign of surrendering our life to God in whatever way, simply just to come up front, and it can even just be off to the sides. And if you just need to get down on your knees as a way of saying, God, I surrender to you. I surrender this to you. The space is open for you. Members from our prayer team will be here to pray with you. And maybe if you're just thinking, I need to commit my life to Jesus truly for the first time, or to recommit my life to Jesus for the first time, all I want you to do is on your Connect card, just check the box, I want to learn more about Jesus, and we will reach out to you and have those conversations to see what some good next steps are for your faith journey in this season, okay? But whatever you gotta do, let's do it. Why wait any longer? Would you pray with me?